I want to do a wee video today on the Scots Irish and the Wusky Rebellion, but before I do, I want to give a shout out to a local distillery in the heart of ancient Mourne. The first legal still, legal being the operative word, in the Mournes for 100 years. Mourne Dew Distillery are keeping the great tradition of Irish whisky alive, and I'm sitting here with one of their triple distilled single malts, and it's out of this world. A very distinct taste, so smooth, and with a wee after hint of peat off it, it's perfect for a night in front of a turf fire. Now, Mourne Dew don't just do whisky, they make gin, rum, and even a poachine, so you can check them out in the link in the description, and I'm sure they'll have something there to suit your own taste. Now on to the Wusky Rebellion. The Wusky Rebellion took place between 1791 and 1794 during the presidency of none other than George Washington himself. It was a violent insurrection caused, of course, by the taxman. Who else? The Wusky Tax was the first tax on domestic product in the fledgling United States, and the Wusky Rebellion was seen as such a threat to the new government that Washington ordered about 13,000 troops to mobilise, if needs be, to crush the rebellion. Now bear in mind that this was as large a force, certainly of exclusively American forces, that Washington commanded, even more than he did during the Revolutionary War against the British. So it was a big deal. Before we look at the Scots Irish connection to the Wusky Rebellion, it's good to get a wee bit of background as to why this text caused such a stir among the Scots Irish on the Pennsylvanian frontier. Now, although the whisky distillers were all affected by this new tax, it affected smaller and more rural distilleries more than most. You see, the larger distillers, especially on the East Coast, who produced whisky and other spirits on a large industrial scale, could pay an upfront fee to cover the tax, meaning that overall their tax worked at about 6 cents per gallon, whereas a weir distiller ended up paying about 9 cents on the gallon. Also in the back country and on the frontier, money stills were just family-run enterprises producing a minuscule amount of spirits, and these weir producers could ill afford any tax at all, let alone what they saw as an exorbitant rate from a East Coastern elite. You see, for most backcountry folk, whisky was more than just a nice wee tipple at the weekend or something you had during a wedding or a ceilidh. It was vital to their economy. Grains like corn and rye could be very difficult to transport hundreds of miles across mountains and wilderness to sell at markets, but them same products could be distilled down and made into easily transportable casks or jars of whisky, a product that wouldn't go off or get ruined by either frost or heat. A shortage of cash as well, literally. Cash was in short supply in the backcountry areas, and this meant that whisky acted as a sort of currency used to barter away. So tax on whisky made everything more expensive. A wee bit like the day whenever fuel goes up in price, then everything else that's carried on lorries and trucks to shops to be sold also goes up in price. So when the whisky was taxed, it meant everything would get dearer for these backcountry folk. Secondly then, the very reason for the tax in the first place was a real bone of contention for money in the backcountry. Now this is where things get a wee bit technical. You see, by the end of the Revolutionary War, the Continental Army hadn't been paid in years, and this fact caused nearly a mutiny among Washington's troops, his soldiers refusing to lay down their weapons and disperse until they'd been properly paid for their service. And of course, after years of fighting the British, the new government had no money to pay them. So effectively, they wrote out IOUs for the soldiers. They were called involuntary credit extensions. And these were debt certificates issued by Congress, and they instructed merchants, etc., to accept these IOUs as currency. But when the soldiers headed home, these IOUs lost most of their value, and they only ended up being worth pennies on the dollar. And in the meantime, politicians like Alexander Hamilton and other sneaky financiers were hatching a plan to make millions out of this predicament. You see, Hamilton lobbied the government to make good on these IOUs and pay the bearer 100% of their value in cash money. Sounds good, doesn't it? However, as this lobbying is going on, Hamilton and other speculators send agents out into the western regions to buy up all the IOUs as cheaply as they could, knowing that their value would soon go through the roof when the government would promise to pay out their full value. So for example, at this stage, a $100 IOU was maybe only paying out $10 or less at a store or market. A speculator might come upon an ex-soldier and offer him $15 for it, and knowing full well that in a matter of months it would be worth the full $100, and so they bought up tens of thousands of these IOUs, knowing they would make a complete killing on them. But how would the practically insolvent government be able to pay out the full value of these debt extensions? You guessed it, via tax, and the Wusky Tax. The Wusky Tax, in fact, was the actual means by which Hamilton and them hoped to pay off the debt incurred by giving the bearers the full value of the credit extensions. So think about it, they went out and bought these things up for pennies off folk and then took them and were able to get millions and millions of dollars out of it. So this didn't ingratiate themselves to the backcountry folk who many of them had fought in the Revolutionary War. So you imagine you're an ex-soldier who's fought for his country, whose whole family has suffered greatly by you being away from home during the war. You left your loved ones in poverty and danger at home, and now you've been completely screwed over by the financial speculators. And you're now taxed for the privilege of being screwed over. This bred great resentment among ordinary folk, so much so that they were willing to bear arms and fight against the very government they had went to war to defend. And of course this area of Pennsylvania and the back country around it where the rebellion took place was where many of the immigrants and the wains the immigrants for Ulster had settled, the very people who brought whisky to the United States in the first place. The things Ulster Scots introduced to North America were prutas. Of course, prutas had came originally from Central and South America, but we brought them back across the water, for they hadn't been grew there for a long time, certainly in North America anyway. And the Ulster Scots reintroduced them, and along with a humble spud they brought fiddles and their whisky stills, and knew they found their precious commodity under threat, and they just weren't going to stand for it. They mobilised and attacked tax collectors wherever they found them. They stripped, tarred and feathered a brave one of them and chased anybody that tried to collect what they saw as an unjust duty. Now, on the other side of the equation, Washington and Hamilton and others in the government saw the Wusky Rebellion as a direct attack against their authority, and they believed that unless the rebellion was put down, it would be a green light to others unhappy with their decisions and an encouragement for others to take up arms against the government. Now, the first shots in the Wusky Rebellion were actually fired at the Miller homestead about 10 miles south of Pittsburgh, when General John Neville guided United States Marshal David Lennox to the property of William Miller. The officers attempted to serve a writ which imposed a fine of $250 for failure to register still and required Miller's appearance in federal court in Philadelphia. Now, William had already sold part of the farm and made plans to move to Kentucky, so he angrily refused to accept the writ, and he ordered the men off his property. Now, farmers in the fields nearby heard the commotion that was going on, and they fired several shots at the departing officers just to send them on their way. And these were the first shots fired in the Wusky Rebellion. Oliver Miller had emigrated from County Antrim in 1742 and set up his homestead, which today has become a museum to the Millers and the Wusky Rebellion. So we see right away from the start the Scots Irish were heavily involved in this rebellion. The actual leader of the rebellion was Revolutionary War hero James McFarlane, and you guessed it, he was from Ulster, born in Omagh in 1751. MacFarlane would actually be killed in action during the Wusky Rebellion, but the first person to die was young Oliver Miller, nephew of the aforementioned William Miller, at what was known as the Battle of Bower Hill, which was really just a skirmish at the home of General Neville. The Wusky Rebellion stirred passions to such a degree that around 600 men marched on Pittsburgh and threatened to burn it to the ground unless the tax agents and their supporters were handed over to them. And on the political front, the Wusky rebels were represented by William Finlay, a congressman from western Pennsylvania, and you guessed it, another Ulster man, born in Ulster in 1741, and he represented Pennsylvania in the US House from 1791 to 1799 and from 1803 to 1817. And by the end of Finlay's career, he was the longest serving member in the House and was the first to hold the honorary title Father of the House. Finlay would later blame, rightly so in my humble opinion, Hamilton for provoking this rebellion. You see, on every front, the Scots Irish were heavily involved in this lesser known episode in American history. And it should be noted that Henry Knox, who at the time was perhaps the best known Scots Irishman, was Secretary of War at the time and on the other side of the conflict, and he had actually issued the call for the troops to be mobilised, and this was done through the newly enacted militia law. The rebels even had their own flags, and the most common flags used were a simple white flag with red stripes on it, and it was usually hung for a liberty pole. So you see, the rebels were harking back to the days of the Revolution, where, remember, the call was nay taxation without representation. Now here they were again, being taxed unfairly as they saw it. There was also flags that read equal taxation and no excise and no asylum for traitors or cowards. The most elaborate flag was with an eagle howling a ribbon in its beak and 13 6-pointed stars scattered along it about the field, and this was most commonly associated with the Wusky Rebellion, and hopefully you'll be able to see it up on the screen. Some rebels even talked about secession, but after the big show at Pittsburgh and now facing Washington's massive army, the rebels melted away, and many were subsequently arrested and a couple charged with treason and sentenced to hang. However, Washington, in a political masterstroke, pardoned them at the last minute. So the Wusky Rebellion ultimately failed. However, the resistance had struck a nerve with people, and the tax became very hard to collect, especially in rural areas, and completely impossible to collect in Kentucky, and it would later be repealed by Jefferson's government in the early 1800s. So there we have it, the Scots Irish willing to go to war in the Wusky Rebellion to protect this most precious of commodities.